I love it when technology actually works. One click and the presentation is live. So it's great to be here. It's great to see so many here. I fully second the fact that why don't we have more WordPress meetup groups? I mean, we had a WordCamp, which is a main conference here in Stockholm, 2011. The next WordCamp was 2014 in Norrköping. I'm hearing rumors that it might be time for another one fairly soon. But between those, we really have nothing, which is a shame because we're talking about the world's biggest publishing system. It's great that we finally do have one. So I also want to welcome you warmly here today. So who am I and why am I standing here? Usually a very good question. My name is Erik Bernskiöld. I'm a lot of things at the same time. I try to be. I work mainly in web strategy, meaning I try and find out and tell clients what they should do, why they should do it, and not just push out a website online mindlessly, forgetting half of the things that they ought to do, broadly speaking. And then I'm also a part-time business advisor. I'm an advisor at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, which coaches companies that start up down there, and I'm their web advisor for all things web. And of course, I run two companies. One's a consulting strategy agency, which is actually turning 5 today, which makes me really proud, where we basically do the strategy bit, take care of all the development from concept to the final thing. And then I firmly believe that this shouldn't actually be only for the big companies that have a big budget and can afford everything. I believe that we can actually, as a community, get all the things we think about and do down to even smaller companies that actually don't have the biggest budget necessarily. I mean, a small business anywhere. They should also be able to have a nice website. And with WordPress, we can do a lot with a small budget as well, which is why I have WordPress agency where we try to incorporate the same ideas. So enough about me, really, and into the topic at hand. I do want to keep this fairly short, maybe 30 minutes, and then say 15 minutes for discussion. So please do keep in mind what are your challenges, what are your experiences with the topic in WordPress, and because that's where the good thing happens. We can talk about the challenges and hopefully solve the challenges, even though that might be a tall order with internationalization in WordPress. So I thought I'd start off with where we are today. What can we do with localization in WordPress? And I wish I could stand here and be like, yay, internationalization is so easy, it's easy to do, we can just click a button and it's done. Sadly, not the case. How many of you have created multilingual websites in WordPress? How many of you found this to be the easiest thing you've ever done? I love it when audiences give me the answer that I expect instead of everyone raising their hands. That would have made my talk a little bit trickier. So you know it's not easy and you know it's not very straightforward. Luckily, WordPress as a WordPress Foundation are realizing this. Because this is a stat from State of the Word, the WordPress conference and the survey this year. And they found that actually WordPress is downloaded today more in a non-English language than it is in English. Which means they're realizing, hey, we need to do something about WordPress being English only, pretty much. What has been. But that begs the question, why multilingual websites in the first place? The answer in a country such as Sweden is obviously really straightforward. We are very few people who speak a minority language, and if we want to communicate with the outside world, we pretty much have to speak English. Hey, the entire evening today is in English. That should probably say something. So the first reason is obviously globalization. We can't go anywhere today without actually being forced on another culture, another language. And in economics and in business theory, we were talking about something called time and distance decay, which basically means the world's getting smaller. Fancy term for a very easy concept that I'm sure you all understand. We can hop on a flight, be in New York in 7-8 hours. That's really impressive. Same with China, which also means we get the cultures mixed up everywhere we are. And it also means we have to get behind a language concept. So a guess, how many languages do you think we have in the world? Would you say 2,000 or above? maybe above 4,000, 5,000. Anyone would guess that we have more than 5,000 languages in the world?
Yeah.
We have over 6,500 languages. This figure is from last year, so I'm not sure if it's changed. Now, granted, most of these, probably 80-90% of these 6,500 are spoken by 2, 3, 5, 10 people. But it still leaves us a couple of thousand which are actively spoken by a large number of people. And we have over 196 countries in the world. We actually have 196 countries in the world. This is why it's important. And as soon as we want to start reaching out to something other than our very own country, we need multilingual websites. In fact, even reaching out today to our very own country, we need a multilingual website. Because we can't be sure that everyone who's visiting a Swedish website today understands Swedish, or force that. While it's a nice idea and a nice concept, that's not necessarily the case. And as we'll see, looking at other countries, they may be multilingual from the start. So before even getting behind and trying to set off building a multilingual website, you actually need to have some appreciation of languages themselves. You don't have to be a language nerd. It's funny because when I'm at high schools and I now and then talk to students, I usually have to finish by saying, oh, learn many languages. It's really important for your career. And I remember sitting there myself, everyone saying, you need to study languages. But it's true. And I don't have to say that to a room full of developers, or mostly developers, say that, hey, languages are cool. But you can't do multilingual sites properly unless you know languages properly. Because what happens is, you don't grasp the full width of languages that are available. For example, we have right-to-left languages, which you need to support online. But most interestingly, which English developers fully forget, is that the word order in other languages than English is different. I used to remember a few examples where you would have, for example, if you had a number that in Swedish or English would be fairly towards the end, in another language they could start with it. It could be completely different. A verb can be somewhere completely in another place than it is in English. And what does developers do? Well, developers usually, if they're really good today, and we've seen a big development over the years, if they're really good, they're going to allow a full string to be translatable in any order. But what many do when they develop themes and plugins is they do this halfway. So they start out with half the string and then decide, I need a code block in here. So I'm going to start with the first part of the sentence, then I'm going to do some code, and then I'm going to finish the sentence. Well, what happens when someone needs to translate this to a language that actually does not have that word order? Basically, it can't be done. So this is something you actually need to understand. And if you appreciate the language and understand the differences that the different languages in the world has, then we have an ability to actually do this properly. Be it for Chinese, which I'm not even going to begin talking about because it's really different, or even some Eastern European languages, which have this completely different order. I mean, even German would be a language which easily has a different word order than Swedish in many cases. So I have 2.5 methods for translation that I really want to talk about today. And you're going to understand why it's 2.5 on this slide. So one's called pure translation. I'm going to go into what these are. The other's called regional adaption. And the final, which is, you can see it much more clearer than I expected to, is Google Translate. And before you laugh, I'm going to make a pretty compelling case that Google Translate is actually a really, really useful tool for making a site multilingual under certain very specific circumstances. Now, I do want to mention that the technical aspect of this is easy to some extent. I would bet within 10 minutes you could all here have a multilingual WordPress site up and running from a technical standpoint. You go grab a plugin, you configure it. It's easy. We can all do that. What's not easy is getting this to work in a large sense and getting this set up so the way that a user can actually use this and an organization can work with this website and that it can fulfill its goals, which is what I'm going to be focusing. So the first method, which I'd like to call pure translation, And the pure is there for emphasis. Translation is actually a very narrow thing, and it's far more narrow than we typically think. So this is the simple approach. I'm dubbing it just add language. Basically, we have a site in Swedish, and we're going to be replicating it in English, or German, or Chinese, or whichever language we want to. We're replicating it. That is, in a WordPress term, we're going to be using a translation plugin. But we're keeping the very same site structure, and we're keeping the very same content. I'm going to come back to why this is so crucial. Because think about what translation actually means. It means not word for word, but content translation exactly as it is. How many of you have ever been on a website? Let's take the case, you're in a country where you don't know the first language. So you're in Germany and you don't know German. And you go to a German website and you click English. What do you want? Well, you expect the very same content that you saw in German to be in English. What do most people do when they create a website? They tend to be smart and say, well, English, that's the language that many speak who do not speak German, therefore they should have some other content. Or it should be a dumbed down version of the content. That's a really bad way to approach it. Because what you're doing is saying, well, if you can't read it in German in this example, you don't deserve to be treated with the content that you were looking for. Basically, it's worthless to a user. In terms of plugin, there are two. I would argue there are two. WPML, which is really powerful, awesome, and I also passionately hate it at the same time. And there's Polylang, which is really nice. It's starting to grow, but isn't as full-fledged feature complete as WPML. I would argue today that for a simple site, you might be able to get away with Polylang. It is not as resource intensive on the server, and it is a bit nicer code behind it. WPML, on the other hand, can be used to power some really, really powerful sites. It is really good. It has a really good admin interface. The code is horrible. It is very resource intensive, but it does work. And it's a premium plugin. Polylang's free. We use WPML for a client powering 13 languages with 13 different editors. And it works. It requires its server, but it does work, and editors are happy to use it. But then, what if we actually want different content for a different language? Well, I started out by arguing that you never ever actually do want different content for a different language. But this is sort of where regional adaption kicks in. This is saying, I want content that is different for different countries. For example, here in Sweden, let's take e-commerce. E-commerce is a brilliant example of this, where you actually have different products that might sell in different countries. It's not language specific, it's country specific. And this is important. And this is sort of where regional adaptation kicks in. You're adapting to a specific region, in this case it is a country. In a WordPress context, this would most definitely mean a multi-site installation. Because if you ever try and manage separate content structures with WPML within the same setup, same install of WordPress, give it a few weeks or months and you're not going to be looking at that site and be able to manage it in a really productive way. I guarantee you. Because WordPress is not meant to be used that way. WPML is not meant to be used that way. Multi-site, on the other hand, is. It's the same common installation. You update it once, you manage it once, it rolls out across any number of sites, but you could easily make different country variations depending on that. I'm going to come to a challenge here, because regional adaptation is where we have the biggest challenge. Because frankly, just translating content and pushing it online is no challenge. You need to have some really beautiful content written. You need to send it off to an agency that does it well, or do it in-house if you speak multiple languages. And then you just need to plug it into pages on your WordPress site. That is actually straightforward. Though I wish it was a core feature in WordPress, or at least a standardized feature, it is still pretty easy for a decent volume in terms of the site. Doing this is where it gets tricky, because this is where WordPress clearly does not have any way of support. Because what you're looking at is each site has potentially a complete different structure with different content, but it's still the same site. You should still be able to navigate between the sites in a multi-site installation. And potentially, you need to be able to translate the different sites. So this is where we can get to 2 levels. And let me come back to that. First, I want to be a little academic. And I've had 2 very academic slides. This is one of them. Before we can start talking about regional adaptation or any sort of adaptation to different countries, we need to understand culture. And if we're going to be talking about culture, we need to be talking about culture in this very same way and have the very same definition. Otherwise, we're going to be talking about different things. So I have this definition. A guy named Ralph Linton in 1945 wrote that a culture is the configuration of learned behavior and results of behavior whose component elements are shared and transmitted by the members of a particular society. It's really long and beautiful. Maybe I lost you halfway. That's not the point. The point is, what he's saying is we're sort of a group, and what we feel and grow up with having sort of feelings together, that is a culture. And that can manifest itself in many different ways. You can read the full body of literature, which is amazing. They usually talk about culture components, where language is probably the easiest and most accessible. Just think about it. If someone comes here to Sweden and tries to speak Swedish with you, you're going to be pretty happy that they're actually trying to do that. And that's sort of built in, because someone's appreciating Swedishness, our culture. So with that being said, we need to be able to adapt and realize that if we're creating a German website, we are appealing to Germans. So we need to leave everything that we as Swedes do at the door and learn about how Germans function, or how US people function, or how British people function, if we're ever to make a website that appeals to them. And then we get to the tricky part, which is locales. If you've set up WordPress in any language but English, you'll know that all the language files have a 2-part sort of language code to them. You have SV_SE, which is basically Sweden Swedish, because we have Sweden Finnish. You don't ever see a language pack created for Sweden Finnish, but it officially exists, which is why we have it. This is easier to illustrate in other countries around the world, and we tend to forget this. Here in Sweden, we speak Swedish, mostly, and then potentially English as an added extra language. But what if we have a country such as Canada? In Canada, they speak English and French. They don't speak English and then some also speak French. They really speak English and French. Go to Quebec in Canada. The road signs are going to be in French. People are going to try and speak to you in French. And they actually have tried to avoid English at all costs. Drive-through is not called drive-through in Quebec. It's called a French version of drive-through. That's how much they really want to avoid English. But this poses a problem because we can't expect someone who clicks French in a global perspective to be from France. That's actually pretty idiotic in a grander sense. And Canada is one of these great examples where we need to have Canada-specific content, and that needs to exist in English and in French. Because otherwise we'd be leaving out the French-speaking population or leaving out the English-speaking population. And we can actually do no inference and no way say, well, the French-speaking people need this type of content. We can't. It should just be a complete, utter translation. Leaving then you to choose Canada to be the primary designator of what content you're going to get. Another country here in Europe is Switzerland, which is perhaps even more interesting because they speak even more languages. They would speak German, they would speak Italian, and they would speak French in about equal proportions, I think. And you would also have the very old language that no one actually speaks, but it's official. It's Rätoromanisch, which is old. No one speaks it, but it exists. So most people in Switzerland speak 3 languages, we in Sweden are about 2.2, 2.3. But there you also have the same problem. Content for Switzerland needs to exist in German, it needs to exist in Italian, and it needs to exist in French. Otherwise, you're leaving out half or a third of the population, even though they know some of the other language. That's just, the fact. So that is why locales are inherently really important as you get to a greater scale. And if you've been to an airline website, or let's take Ikea as an example. It's always nice to take Ikea as an example as a Swede, because we'll have our Ikea, right? If you go to Ikea's website, you're going to be asked, in many airlines, you're going to be asked, what country are you in? Because that that's the designator for what product you're going to get. And then you're going to be asked, all right, what language do you speak? And these are two different things. And obviously we can say, oh, I speak German, therefore I'm in Germany. I speak French, therefore I'm either in Canada, I'm in Africa, I could be in South America, I could also be in the Netherlands, I could be in Switzerland, right? Where am I? It's a big difference between Africa and France, or the Netherlands, for sure. So that's important to think about before embarking on creating a website and trying to do translation and then failing at it, because what you're actually doing is not translation. Translation is what WPML does really nice, Polylang 2, but it is not solving some of the issues that you may have or some of the goals you may have. So again, the technical aspect is really easy. The viable long-term solution is hard. Because you also have the added problem of maintaining a site that has several languages, even if you just do translation. When you have a site that runs on 13 different languages, every time you want to push out a new feature to that site, you will need to translate 13 languages worth of strings. Even if you just change one string, you need to have that sent off and translated into 13 languages, which can be a pain, and you need to adjust for that in your processes. And of course, you also can't make a mess of WordPress, because then no one's going to be able to use it backend, ever. Which is a challenge today in WordPress. So a few words on user experience, or finish off on. The first is user focus. And the most important thing, I would argue, the only thing that we do as designers or developers or web professionals in any sense is we focus on the user and we try to make something beautiful for the user to use. This could mean, and this is important, the user is definitely not just the front-end user clicking on the website. The user is most definitely also an editor in the organization trying to update the site. Too many sites are created in a way that nobody can ever update, and therefore they're not getting updated. And if they're not getting updated, they're also not good for the end user on the website. But a user focus here also means we need to really think about the user and the end user, what he or she wants from the website that we're trying to make multilingual. Do they want the translation? Do they want content that's adapted to where they specifically are? And not leaving someone out. And when we start thinking about this, this is when we can actually create a useful solution that users love. And the first thing is that translations needs to be good. And I say this sort of as a sigh because too many translations are done very poorly. Because here's where many agencies think we can save some money here. Right? I know German decently, all right? So I happen to speak fluent German, yet I would not, and this might be a special case for German, but I would never let my translated German go out on a public website. Because German is a language where you make frequent grammar errors, I can assure you. Which dictates just one grammar error on a website is going to bring down the whole impression for the company right away. Imagine you going to, say, an American corporation's website, which happens to be translated into Swedish. The likelihood of this occurring is probably 0, but let's just imagine this is the case. And then you find the content is not really very well translated into Swedish. Would you say to yourself, oh, well, they've attempted to do it in Swedish, so I'm going to be fine with it for now? Or are you going to think to yourself, oh, they can't get it right in my language. I don't like you. That's probably the closer of the two, what you're going to be thinking, which is why it's important to make translations great. And you also need to not just translate them, but you need to validate them. Because if you send something that is sort of technical to a translator who actually doesn't know what has an in-depth knowledge of what they're translating, it may come back being technically correct, but it may also come back being terms that no one's ever using. And you also need someone who knows the language to proofread what you're getting back. I had an agency come back with a translation in Dutch, and a couple of the strings were in Polish. That's magnificent. And had that gone out in the live app, that wouldn't be so nice, because the first person who would have caught it would be a user who would never say anything. And probably the 100th or 1,000th user would know and realize and say, oh, that's in Polish, and they would let the company know. But most people would just sort of silently fail, which would be really bad. There are luckily a few tools that are available to us to make this easy. WordPress has its own BlockPress system, which is where much of WordPress translation is done. It's not the most beautiful system in the world, sort of legacy WordPress looks, but it's open source. You can install it on your site. It's free to use in this sense, and it does function really well. As I said, we have a project with 13 languages where none of the users are in any way technical, and we've invited them to BlockPress, and they manage without actually having to ask any questions about how to translate. So I think that does work pretty well. If the client has a little bigger budget, then Transifex or poeditor.com, they're really beautiful online tools for managing translations. You can easily send better updates, get reports on how the translation is progressing. All of these things that are really nice in a project of multilingual scale. But I would definitely use them to keep track of how the translations are doing, how it's progressing. Because as soon as you change a string, it needs to go off to translation. And if you can have the translator be notified at regular intervals that they need to do something, you can create automation and you can get that into your development and deployment practices. And it is all about setting expectations. Because that's what we're doing. When we're saying we have a multilingual website, we're also saying this is a site that is as good as if it was created by a company or an agency that speaks the local language, that understands the local culture, that exists where it's trying to be. If you're a Swedish company in Germany, well, you're going to get major bonus points because you're Swedish, because many in Germany actually love Sweden, but you're not going to get any bonus points for screwing up the German when you're trying to sell someone something. And that's going to be the same for a company coming from Sweden to the US to China. Not to put a finer point in it, China's going to be really complex. So you need to understand it, and you actually need to meet the expectations, which are set at native high level. So you're competing with native speakers. Don't kid yourself thinking that you have it easier because you're translating. You do not. And then, this is, again, a very specific thing, but it deserves to be mentioned. Because so many people fail to create useful language switchers. Maybe you just have a flag, and the more languages you add, you sort of have to rely on the fact that people know the flags of the world. Or you just have things in a native language. Well, imagine if you switch to a language and you can't get back. So think about how the user is going to do it. Maybe having 20 flags is not a very user-friendly solution. Maybe having a drop-down in that sense is nicer. And especially when you're switching to the regional adoption method, which basically means you have to choose a country and then a language, that really puts some stress on how you design your language switchers. And you need to make sure they're really, really user-friendly. And then I did say I have a method 0.5. I don't think it's worth much more than half a method point, because it is cheating, and it's Google Translate. Don't we all love Google Translate? Yes. How many use Google Translate daily?
Every day.
Almost daily, at least. A couple of times a week. Well, so, I mean, Google Translate has become so much better over the years. The translation English to Swedish, I would argue, in many cases is really, really good. Some things it does really, really badly. But if you know the language, if you have an understanding of 2 languages, you're going to get some pretty decent results using Google Translate. And some strings in a project you could actually, if you knew the language you're translating into, by a decent margin, get through by Google Translate. But I would argue you could actually power a full website's multilingual strategy on just Google Translate. But it comes at setting expectations. Because if you define it as, hey, look at my multilingual website that exists in all of these languages, and when you click on it, it secretly uses Google Translate. What have you done? Well, you've set the expectation. This is a perfect translation. This is a perfectly adapted site. And what is the user getting? Arguably not the world's greatest translation. It can be pretty funny sometimes. And especially translating, say, Swedish into Danish, I've noticed it doesn't do a very good job. To English, for most languages, yes. Between other languages, not as good. Let's face it, Swedish is not that big of a language, nor is Danish or Norwegian. There it has some problems. But if you clearly mark, translate using Google Translate, big fat button at the top or call out, then what are you doing? Well, you're saying, I'm offering you an easy way to view this website in any language that you like. But I want you to know it's not excellent. It's just Google Translate. But I'm offering this to you in a very easy and accessible way. Is this better than not doing it at all? We could discuss that. I would arguably say for some, yes, it would be. For some, the accessibility aspect of actually being able to present the language and present the site in multiple languages trumps the fact that it's not as great of a translation. Because you would simply be excluding too many people if it weren't. And if it's not feasible for the company in a budget perspective, because at the end of the day, that's what we always have to weigh our solutions against, then maybe it is a decent solution. I would argue at least worth half a method. Let's not put it on a big site. Let's try and make room for a budget for this. But if it is a site that needs to be accessible, why not? What are we going to lose by including this rather than nothing as an option? Because most people are technically savvy enough to go to Google Translate, be able to find the place where they enter a URL and translate the site. We're just making it easier for them. So with that, I'm going to spin my 2 slides around. So I'm going to do this one first. I'm on the internet. Would you be surprised? I'm also fairly easy to find because I happen to be the only one in the world with my very tough to spell name. So if you get it right, you can easily find me. If there's anything, we're here all the night, but please do connect, send an email, questions, anything. That's it. With that, the most fun part is questions. If you have any questions specifically, go ahead. If you want to share some challenge or some experiences that you would input on or that you think were really great, that's even better, I would argue. So, thank you. And now I challenge someone to have an experience they want to share or a question. Otherwise, this part's going to fall flat.
Could you make the SEO-friendly URLs multilingual as well? Help SEO in different languages?
I would argue yes, for sure. There might be cases when that's not feasible. For example, I would say an edit page, for example, tied into a platform. You'd be adding a profile, a register profile, or updating a profile. There might not be a harm that that's called update in all languages. Ideally, I think they should be translated. Any other opinions on translating that? How many of you think, yes, translate slugs? How many of you think, no, don't translate slugs? Right, so the majority thinks yes, because I'm excluding all of you who didn't want to answer.
Well, you mentioned before that Google Translate doesn't really perform well between Swedish and Danish, for example.
That's my personal
And
experience.
I agree perfectly, because as far as I understand, they always have English as the origin. So they go from Swedish to English, and then they do a translation from English to Danish, which means that we'll actually get a tier translation, and that will always suck. Because you don't follow the context.
Yeah.
You need to have the context adaptation from one language to the other, and then the context adaptation one more time.
Absolutely.
And that will fail.
Yes. I actually saw an article that I had to translate from Danish into Swedish. I know, shame on me. But where they actually managed to translate the currency sort of to dollars. So, but leave the number intact. So it's a completely different.
So my recommendation would be actually to, if you're going to have a multi-site that is going to be translated from with Google Translate as the main idea, then you're going to actually start with English as your target. Because then you will get a better context to the other languages, and you will get a fairly good result, even if you're not splendid in English.
True. Very good point. Very good point. Because at least that's almost always feasible. 2 languages, Swedish, English, would probably always be feasible. So I think that's an excellent solution.
Would you recommend automatically switching to the local language, or should it always be a user selection?
I'm on the fence about that. I'm always on the fence about recognizing based on something that's never right. I used to be against it, thinking, well, because I travel a lot, so I would usually get recognized into speaking a language that I don't speak, or being somewhere where I'm really not. But then again, I think the key point is, how large of a percentage do you actually get right? If it's high enough, you might well decide that, well, screw the grumpy people like me, who usually get it wrong, to the benefit of 80%, where you usually get it right. But I would say that sort of decision, I would try it because it's an idea that feels good to the user. But I would also try and follow it up with, if it's useful to the users that actually land on the page that you're sending them to. Because if it's not, we're doing them a disservice. And I think that could be on a case-by-case basis. So I'm on the fence, to be honest. Anyone else? Do you like being directed to a local language or not?
Depends on the context.
Yeah.
The user experience, actually.
Yeah, I mean, airlines, if you use that as an example, they typically, some get it. Some do it decently, others do it horribly. Having multiple domains is probably an easy way. So if you type in .se, you would get to Swedish or Sweden English or Sweden Swedish. That would be fairly easily done. Because you probably just type company name .your domain if you have the ability to purchase them all. Yeah.
So I had one time this multilingual site, and it was very bad. Is it it's not better to have 2 different domains than try to make everything in the same?
Repeat the question.
Yeah. So the question is it better to have 2 separate sites than to have sort of one multilingual translated site? That's on a case-by-case basis for me. I think done well in separating between translation and actually changing structure and content, using something as WPML or Polylang works fine, and it just creates an added nuisance having to maintain a separate site, even if it is under multi-site. Because chances are there are so many elements that are shared between the pages that you get added when you update one page, you get the changes added to both pages. And it would require a lot more to do that in a multi-site configuration. But then sometimes you actually do want that disconnect because it just gets messy, in which case a multi-site would make sense, and make a lot of sense. But I think that too is a very case-by-case basis, and it's hard to say a general rule. which is sort of to the point why I'm trying not to focus on the full technical solutions, because it's going to depend. You're going to build something for Schibsted Aftonbladet that's going to be, you know, a completely different scale with editors that needs to come in, it needs to work fine, and it needs to be technically viable. And then the medium-sized business is going to have another primary focus and objective. And that needs us to just evaluate, oh, right, what are we trying to do? What are the pitfalls of these methods? And then trying to find the best one of them.
You mentioned a few plugins, and I was thinking if you or maybe anyone else in the room has tried Babel by Code for the People. And if you have any opinion on that?
But I am looking forward to trying it now. You have not heard about it. But you remind me to mention a plugin that I forgot, which I don't ever want anyone to even think about using. If you want to be called a professional, Q Translate. I'm hearing it. Just don't, because it ruins your website. It just adds in custom comments into. It's just a horrible way of doing it. Never, ever, ever, ever use Q Translate, or we might just strip you off the WordPress professional title. If you've used it, no worries. But if you use it after now and today, shame on you, says everyone in this room.
Here, here.
Thanks for reminding me. All right, I see if we're keeping to the time schedule.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, great.
You mentioned WordPress.
Yes.
I keep hearing about it. I haven't used it myself, so I guess one question is a bit more about what it is and how it can be used, and then also language packs. It's also something that I keep hearing about, and like centralizing, updating translations for plugins and stuff like that. Like, how does that tie in together, and what is WordPress? Do you know more about that, or anyone else, I guess?
Yeah, so WordPress is basically, if you're building a theme or building a custom plugin for a customer that is going to be translated, you're going to be having tons and tons of strings that need to be translated. WordPress is a graphical interface that just makes people able to go online, and you can assign them to a language, and they can easily type in the translations. There's code reference if they need to. This beats having to use POEdit on the Mac, for example. It's just a nicer way of doing it, less technical. And it allows you to go back and validate. You can see stats. You can see so many percent is translated and untranslated, and you can follow up in a better way. The tricky part is, and what I would love it to do, is have some way of syncing that back into the site as an auto-update, or a repository sync with Git, for example. Doesn't exist today, and that would be the same. I think WordPress core is starting to go towards a sort of full centralized translation repository, because there is today an option of getting and downloading just language packs, which I think is great, because it's far too much of a problem today to go and translate different plugins. You may have to ask a developer, and then they have to add it into their plugin, and then it should be maintained. It's tricky, and everyone uses a different system. It would be nice if they bring this together, which I think they're doing. As I said, they are recognizing that this is important. I could easily show you a WordPress setup, but I don't want to do it on the live stream out of respect to the client. But I could show you afterwards, no problem.
But it's pretty much like editor.
Yeah, but in a... I hate to use the word nice graphical interface, but it is a graphical interface, which doesn't completely suck, but it's not beautiful. Let's put it that way. All right, so that keeps us on the time schedule. I think it is time for that break with some food,
Exactly.
which I'm looking forward to.
Yeah.
So thank you for my part of this, and well, happy evening. It's going to be a long one.